Start na.
Okay. Um, we are here to present the Japanese occupation of Moroland and its aftermath. Here we're going to discuss the its occupation from and the condition of the Moroland during Japanese occupation, their reaction, and the impact of their settlement. So of course we have to start with the introduction. The Commonwealth's government existence would be disrupted by the onset of World War II in 1941. The President Manuel L. Quezon and other Commonwealth government leaders will depart from the Philippines for Australia and eventually to the United States. President Quezon still continued to represent as president of the de jure government while as a Japanese-sponsored republic led by President Jose P. Laurel was established. It should be remembered that the Japanese goal throughout World War II was to establish an empire and push into Asia. The reason behind Japan's Asian expansion was summed up in the phrase Asia for Asians. Japan considered itself as the head of a self-proclaimed vocation of Asian liberation while colonizing Asian countries.
So, s- so the next part is what was the condition of Moroland during the Japanese occupation. So at first, the Japanese invasion of Davao and Holo in December 1941 marked the commencement of World War II in Moroland or in Mindanao. Cotabato and Lanao would be invaded in 1942 as well. These locations were occupied in order to provide air bases for the Japanese troops' final drive and penetration into Borneo and Celebes. So, from this paragraph, we it discussed that the the Japanese invaded the Morolan or the Mindanao in order to provide a foothold into southern Asia. So the Japanese could have swung the tide in their favor if they had researched and comprehended the predicament of the Moros and Lumads of Mindanao and Sulu. They may have used Moro discontent with the Commonwealth administration and the discriminating legislation it enacted to gain Moro allegiance and collaboration on the Japanese side. Um, because the because kuwan, the Moros in the Moroland is not that united before World War II happened. Maybe if the Japanese know that predicament, they can invade, they can occupy, or they can really hold off or hold on Mindanao or Moroland much better. But because maybe they will not run, it is not worth it to know more about Moroland. So the Japanese occupation in Moroland or Mindanao is in this belief. Nonetheless, they merely treated the Moros and same way they did the most of local natives they conquered. So this is the statement where the Japanese somewhat underestimated the Moros. So this one this resulted to a uh, to a to problems in holding Moroland. The Japanese invading forces were notorious for their aggressive martial brutality and violence during the occupation. On the other hand, the Japanese arrival was a blessing in disguise since it connected Muslim and Christian connections. This was demonstrated by the Moros' eagerness to assist the United States Army forces in the Far East, or USAFFE, when they readily joined guerrilla units, such that these units were composed of Muslim and Christian volunteers. So in the fight against the Japanese invaders in Moroland, this the this is somewhat the key for the Muslims and Christians to unite against one enemy or common enemy. So according to Peter Gowing, in Cotabato, guerrilla forces were organized by Dato Salipada Pendatun and his brother-in-law Dato Untog Matalam. They were made up of both Muslims and Christians and controlled the vast interior parts of the province. As in Cotabato, the Lanao guerrillas were both Muslims and Christians. So, according to Peter Gowing daw, it is truly an alliance between Muslims and Christians in the fight against the Japanese occupation or Japanese colonize colonize Japanese invaders. Same might be said about Sulu. Despite historic animosities, Moros and Christians on the islands joined forces in the resistance fight against the Japanese. In reality, a Christian, Colonel Alejandro Suarez, took command of the 125th 100 Infantry Regiment of the guerrilla troops in Sulu, which included Muslims and Christians. While the guerrilla campaign looks to have been effective, they did not go without pain, and they did not go without pain and difficulty in their fight against the Japanese. Oral traditions known as Kisa in Sulu, for example, depict the tremendous hardships of Sulu combatants. So, despite the alliance between the Muslims and Christians, or Muslims and other Filipinos, it is not that it is not that uh or bag eh, it doesn't give assurance that the fight against the Japanese was so effective and was so easy. There are some predicaments that was caused by the kind of attack that the Allied forces made against the Japanese. An example is the guerrilla campaign. So the uh, fighting sa pa to na? A guerrilla campaign is not that uh is not that easy bitaw. Like there are some hardships to be expected, such that the Sulu combatants experience hardships, tre- tremendous hardships to be exact. The Tapikans were a unit of the guerrilla forces that were constantly followed by the Japanese in one occasion. They were forced to consume whatever edibles they could find after being driven into the harsh forest of Tawi-Tawi. They forced themselves to consume wild boar and bitter fruit called as tapikan, from which they earned their name. Because eating pork is forbidden in Islam, they rationalized it by claiming that they would starve to death if they did not. Allah would undoubtedly comprehend. So there was a unit of guerrilla forces. There was a unit of a guerrilla force called the Tapikans. The Tapikans the Tapikans were uh the Tapikans were driven out by the Japanese forces into the harsh forest of Tawi-Tawi. So as what I've said earlier, that that in a guerrilla campaign, hardships must be expected. Tremendous hardships to be exact. So these Tapikans, uh, these Tapikans ate wild boar and a bitter fruit called tapikan from which they earned their name. So we all know that eating eating pork is forbidden in Islam or a haram. So they still ate pork or wild boar despite their beliefs because they believe that Allah would undoubtedly comprehend and accept their predicament. So next,
What were the reactions to the Japanese occupation? People in Moroland initially reacted with panic, shock, and disbelief on the day of the Japanese invasion. Nobody expected the Japanese to come to Hulu and occupy it. For example, in Sulu, in actuality, the Japanese landing troops encountered only a relatively feeble opposition, with the action lasting only around 2 hours. So it had suffered great loss of life and tremendous physical destruction by the time the was over. Next slide. There were moral leaders who believed that cooperating with the Japanese preferable than facing the new colonizers' fury and harshness. However, for many of those who aided the Japanese, it was their own way of making the most bad circumstances. So in this, they planned that to collaborate with the Japanese to avoid much destruction or kanang kanang mga kaysa mga dagag casualties hitabo. Next. The Sultan sa the Sultan Ramain Alauya Alonto expressed his point of view in a letter to the American colonel who commanded the Mindanao guerrilla units. He said that before the surrender, I assured the late General Fort all the cooperation that could possibly come from me. And even after the surrender, I wanted to carry on the fight with my people who had been faithful to me and loyal to our cause. And I have resolved then to stay in the forest, which I could possibly do even for years. But with the Japanese threats to burn houses and harass my people, after a thorough and a mature deliberation, I had no alternative except to surrender to protect life and property from lawlessness and cruelty of our enemy. As a senator-elect, it is my paramount duty and sacred one above everything else to render my people such service which I have been executing day in a day out since that fateful day of my surrender for the sake of the civilian population, especially women and children. Next. So, Dato Umbra Amil Bangsa of Sulu, Dato Sali Uto Talum, and Dato Gulamu Rasul of Cotabato, and Dato Sinsuat Balabaran, and Dato Mimandang Piang of Cotabato were among the Moro leaders who believed it was in their people best interest to support Japanese policies. They were certain that their people would understand their motives and would not hold them responsible for helping with the Japanese. So next. The Japanese would therefore resort to engaging the younger generation of Moro leaders in seminars and leadership development programs in the hopes of re-educating and redirecting their biases and attitudes along Japanese lines. However, Japanese times and resources were insufficient to maintain these efforts, which achieved no long-term benefits. If the Japanese accomplished anything during their occupation of Moroland, it was the guarded enthusiastic obedience of Moros living in the occupied towns.
So next is the impact of Japanese occupation on Moroland and its people. For all the agony it caused throughout the war years, the Japanese occupation looks to have been short. While not insignificant on the surface, nonetheless, despite its limited duration, it had three long-lasting impacts on Moro-Filipino ties. Peter Growing said that the first impact is that the Japanese occupation forged Muslim-Christian alliances that lasted long after the war. Many Muslims felt fulfillment in fighting with Christians against a shared aggressor and therefore helping in the defense of the Philippines. Second is that the war damage compensation and back pay awards made to numerous Moros who were formally recognized as former guerrillas resulted in a huge growth in Moroland's landed assets. As more money became available to sponsor rising numbers of pilgrims on the Hajj, building mosques and madrasas, and support huge public religious events. This in turn helped finance a comeback of Islam in post-war Moroland. Third is that the extensive provision of weaponry and ammunition by the Japanese impacted Moro ties with the Philippine country. The Moro guerrillas were tough to persuade to hand over their weapons after the battle. As a result, in the post-war period, Moros had the means to voice more than modest protest against governmental policies, programs, and the people they despised. So, uh, so Peter Growing said that first, the first impact, the first long-lasting impact that caused by the Japanese occupation was the alliance of Muslim and Christians because of its same same goal or shared aggressor. Second is the compensation, which helped them to build mosques and supported religious public events. And the third are, even though it's more likely a negative impact, but Moro guerrillas were tough to persuade to hand over their weapons that were used in the war. Next, next, sa lessons. So lessons learned and peace message. The Second World War demonstrated that Filipinos of whatever belief, position, or affiliation could work together toward common aims and objectives. Moros and Christians can work together to protect their independence and territory if properly motivated and propelled by similar ambitions and goals. The Mindanao problem, for example, can only be resolved if all parties, including Moros, Christians, and Lumads, share the belief that under a new governmental entity, no one will be left behind or discriminated against. all sectors will benefit from inclusive economic growth and development under a system of peace, harmony, equality, and justice. And thank you.
So that's all for our report about the Japanese occupation Japanese occupation in the Moroland during World War II. So that's all. Thank you.